What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be talking about X-Men: The Last Stand. So here we are, continuing on my X-Men series of reviews. If you're just hopping in, we've already covered the first and second one, and I already talked about the fact that so far, before starting this series, had already done X-Men Dark Phoenix back in the day when that first originally came out, as well as the PG-13 Christmas version of Deadpool 2 called Once Upon a Deadpool. But I wanted to properly go through all the X-Men films that I've yet to cover here on the channel and do a review for it here and have a different guest in every video. And my guest today is very special because it's my buddy Mike from Did You See That? And he told me when we were talking about this series that he has never actually seen the first 3 X-Men films. And unless I'm having somebody cover an entire trilogy or series with me, I very rarely ask somebody to watch a movie for me and cover it for me here that they kind of have to go back and watch other things for. But thankfully Mike was down to do so, and I just wanted to know what he thought about the first 3 X-Men films in general. And even though this is mainly all about the third one, he will touch on that in just a little bit. But I do want to say a big thanks to Mike for taking the time to watch 3 movies for this review about one of them. And so I do really appreciate him joining me here for this one, X-Men: The Last Stand, a movie that gets a lot of crap and honestly I've always kind of loved. If I'm completely honest, my favorite of the first 3 is probably the second overall, with the first one maybe being a better film than the third film. But this one for me, even though it is messy at times and doesn't do a lot of things that I necessarily love, I find this film to just be so much fun to watch, and as a kid I loved it. This movie came out in 2006 and I remember that opening day in theaters. I remember the opening day of all these movies in theaters, and yeah, definitely some of my favorite memories. But leading up to this one, there was so much hype. I remember playing, X-Men in the playground with all my friends leading up to the release of this one, and yeah, I was just really hyped to see X-Men: The Not So Last Stand. This film is directed by Ratner, who's best known for his work on the Rush Hour series, and yeah, Bryan Singer did not come back to direct this one, but he would return later on to direct Days of Future Past, kind of bringing this trilogy together with the prequel set of movies that was established with First Class. And then you have writers on this film like Simon Kinberg, who would continue on with this franchise in a producing level and a writing level, and then eventually having his directorial debut for Dark Phoenix, which he also wrote, which also touches on the Phoenix. And yeah, I wasn't a crazy fan of that. I already reviewed it here on the channel, as I said, and I highly recommend going and checking out that review if you have not already checked it out. And alongside Simon Kinberg, you also have Zach Penn writing this movie as well. And yeah, overall what I'll say is this movie does have some elements of its writing that are a little bit messy, and there are a lot of characters that are jam-packed in this movie that do kind of feel like a hey, I know that character kind of thing, and not so much necessarily them being there for a certain reason. But yeah, this is just a good fun popcorn film to me, and despite some of those negatives, I just genuinely have a good nostalgic time with this, watching this movie today. So the basic premise of X-Men: The Last Stand is essentially we have the government finding a way to cure mutants, and they find the way to cure mutants by actually finding a mutant himself whose ability is to nullify the abilities of other mutants if they're within his radius. So they end up taking this mutant's power and making weapons out of it and creating a cure so that people can come and be cured of being a mutant. As you can imagine, there's a huge part of the mutant community that does not appreciate even the idea of a cure. They don't feel like they should be cured, that they need to be cured. But there are also some, like Rogue in this film, who is completely and utterly sidelined, even though Anna Paquin does fine in the film, I suppose, even though I'm not crazy about her version of Rogue. And other individuals, of course, they want to go and get cured because maybe their mutation doesn't really allow them to live a normal life like some of the others who have really cool powers but look normal. And once again, you have people in this film like Hugh Jackman, Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, Halle Berry, Famke Janssen, James Marsden, and so many others. And outside of that, you also have some new cast members in here like Kelsey Grammer, who comes in to play Beast, which doesn't really necessarily line up with what we saw of Hank McCoy in the little cameo in the second film. You also have Vinnie Jones as Juggernaut, giving us one of the greatest lines in any X-Men film. And then you also have Elliot Page as Shadowcat, Kitty Pryde. Obviously, Elliot Page was Ellen Page at the time and is now Elliot Page. It was a recasting of who we had seen as Shadowcat before, even though in the previous films it was more of a cameo and a reference in dialogue. And this time around, they actually gave Shadowcat something to do. Then you also have Ben Foster playing Angel, Angel in here, and he's kind of wasted, to be completely and utterly honest. I wasn't necessarily crazy with what they did with Angel in this movie, especially since the movie opens with a young Angel trying to cut off his wings in a really dramatic scene that ultimately doesn't really lead to a whole lot in this movie, because he doesn't really have too much to do on a character level, which is a damn shame. And you have tons of other new faces in here, whether they're playing a small cameo character in the back or having a bigger role in the movie. But somebody I want to mention specifically is Bill Duke as the character of Trask, who is the same character that Peter Dinklage plays in Days of Future Past. And, you know, kind of like what I mentioned with Beast, and I've mentioned it in my reviews for the first and second one, yeah, one of my biggest letdowns when it comes to these X-Men films is that they didn't really have the foresight to plan things out. And all of these movies have various iterations of characters that you'll see in other films in timelines that don't necessarily make sense. Characters like Jubilee that you see in the background about pretty much all of these, but doesn't really become a character that actually does anything, and really doesn't even do much even when she shows up later on in like Apocalypse and stuff, which again, timeline wise doesn't really make sense because we're seeing her super young here and she's younger in those other films. It just doesn't make sense. And so, yeah, you know, this one is the most apparent one. You know, Bill Duke playing Trask, and then, you know, Peter Dinklage playing Trask in Days of Future Past. Yeah, when it comes to continuity and just like, you know, keeping this all feeling cohesive, these films are all over the place. But beyond a lot of the inconsistencies and some of the things that don't work about this film, I just genuinely find this to be a pretty good time, and I'm going to talk a lot more about what I enjoy about this film in just a moment. But for now, let's go ahead and hear what Mike from Did You See That had to say about this.
Hey, what's up everyone? Thank you, Anthony, once again for having me back onto your channel, and this time actually asking me to check out X-Men 3 The Last Stand. But what's actually interesting about this review, guys, is that I had actually never seen the first 3 X-Men movies previously before Anthony asked me to jump on for X-Men The Last Stand. So funny story is, I actually checked out the other X-Men's following the first 3 movies. I've seen all of those, but not the original core 3. So I had a bit of catching up to do. What I will say firstly, just very quickly about number 1 and 2, is that number 1 was my favourite just because it was kind of like the first origin story. I always like kind of like a grounded, more origin story as such. So that's why I like the first one better than X-Men 2. But X-Men The Last Stand, what is very interesting also is that Bryan Singer doesn't return to direct this movie. We actually get Brett Ratner, if I've got that correctly. So Brett Ratner stepped in, and he's mainly known for doing like the Rush Hour movies. So he's definitely got like a lot of comedic background in terms of directing those movies and action octane movies. And with X-Men The Last Stand, I'm not going to go into too many spoilers or anything. If Anthony wants to in his versions, then fair play, that's on him. But what I will say is that I enjoyed this movie. I do know that online it has got kind of a lot of like hate towards it and a lot of kind of negative words, and I can honestly say I don't agree with that, because this movie, although sometimes the CG maybe hasn't aged as well, there's some storylines that's definitely got plot holes, and I was wondering, well, something happened in the previous movie, then it's in this movie. How does that kind of work out? But what I will say is that I enjoyed this movie. There's too many storylines going on at times, yeah, for sure. But I felt like the action scenes really grabbed me in and grabbed my attention. I was invested in what was going on in the screen. Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart give phenomenal performances as Magneto and of course Charles Xavier. So those two really, I think, stood out more than the rest. Now, that's kind of a given with the X-Men movies, besides, I guess, like Hugh Jackman and Halle Berry, but we get less of James Marsden's character as Cyclops, and we get less of Mystique in this movie. I felt like it was a bit of a missed opportunity for sure, and I liked like kind of what they were building on with those characters in the past 2 movies. But yeah, in this one, I can honestly say that I was engrossed in this movie. I wasn't bored throughout it. And yet again, if you look past any of like the dated CG, but I mean this was 2006, so I can't really fault it too much for that. But if you look past all that, it was an engrossing story. I found myself very entertained by this movie, and I really found myself actually really just sitting back, relaxing, and enjoyed it also. Again, I think across the board performances are pretty good, and you can definitely tell like Hugh Jackman was ready for kind of maybe like his own standalone movies, or maybe showcase him more as Wolverine. He was ready for that. I mean, probably like the first movie to be fair, but definitely by this one, he was ready to kind of shine and kind of just have that spotlight on him and his own origins. And yeah, I actually really liked X-Men 3 The Last Stand, so I really do have to thank Anthony firstly for having me check out the 3 original X-Men movies, because I hadn't seen them previously. So I definitely have them under my arsenal now and know a bit more of the backstory and what makes into like Days of Future Past and so forth, whereas before I was just like, oh, okay, that's a cool like little bit, but then it was jumping in between those original movies, I believe, and yeah, obviously now it definitely makes a lot more sense. But I also want to thank Anthony as well for having me onto the channel and having me on to drop my thoughts on X-Men 3 The Last Stand. So man, I'm going to hand it over back to you and your remaining thoughts on the movie. And once again, thank you for allowing me back on to the channel, and I'll see you guys later.
A big thanks to Mike for being here in this video. Again, my friend, I genuinely appreciate you taking the time to watch 3 movies just to review one of them, and it was great to hear your thoughts on the trilogy, but on this one specifically. And I'm glad you too don't feel like this movie deserves all the hate it gets, because besides the fact that this film is a little messy in its storytelling, I do enjoy a lot about it. I mentioned earlier that this movie really hones in on the fact that there's a cure for mutants, but I haven't yet mentioned that this film also has the Dark Phoenix storyline. Now, let's just go ahead and get this out of the way. This movie in no way, shape, or form adapts that story the way that it's supposed to be done. And they made the Dark Phoenix film that tried to do it again, and honestly, I find this iteration of the Dark Phoenix story to be far more compelling and built up to than that iteration, even if that iteration has elements that are a little bit more in line with the comic book version of the story. For me, I honestly enjoy what they do with the Dark Phoenix thing here, though I feel like there are too many elements around it that kind of bog it down at times. Overall, seeing Famke Janssen come back to play the character of Jean Grey is fantastic. One of my biggest disappointments is the fact that James Marsden is killed off super early. Now, they do that obviously to set up a sense of stakes. I believe James Marsden was also filming something else at the time, but you know, they're trying to set up the stakes of the fact that, you know, Jean Grey is not who we remember her to be, because she's killing the man she loves. And this does lead to a lot of really great moments in this movie. I really enjoy the scene with Professor Xavier, Magneto, and Jean Grey, and all the other X-Men and the Brotherhood that are fighting inside of Jean Grey's old home, where Professor Xavier ends up being killed, which does not make any sense with him returning later on in The Wolverine, even though the post-credit scene for this movie tries to explain that, but doesn't really, to be completely and utterly honest. And yeah, you know, I find that this movie for the most part has a really good version of the Dark Phoenix story, not because it's a good adaptation, not because it is in any way, shape, or form aligned with the comic book story, but I do think that they did a good job of taking the bare bones of what the Dark Phoenix narrative is and making it work for the continuity that we've seen play out here. Ultimately, I do think though that killing Cyclops off so early with Jean Grey returning in this film was a detriment, because for me, when you look at the end of the second film, that emotion when she passes away, when she sacrifices herself with all the X-Men on the X-Jet, specifically between Hugh Jackman and James Marsden in that scene, it's impactful, it's emotional, and it grips me every time I watch it. And you know, going into the third film, I love all the scenes with James Marsden. I just wish that he would have been around for a little bit more of what's going on with Jean Grey, because I feel like he could have been a pivotal part to that story. Beyond that, I think that this movie for the most part does a good job of telling its story. It's got really fun action. Definitely some of the CG in this movie does not hold up. There are definitely moments in this movie where the CG is very apparently bad, but there are moments that also look really good. There's a lot of really dope fucking action and some really funny moments as well. There are great one-liners, and there are a lot of moments with characters that I really do enjoy. There's a lot about this movie, again, that doesn't necessarily feel 100% consistent with the other films that would come after this and before it, but overall, I do find this to be an enjoyable watch. I find the movie to be very action-packed. I love the score. I love the emotion that's brought to this movie that I feel maybe you don't necessarily have in the first film, because you don't have the character building that had already happened in the first and the second film leading up to this one. I think that there's a lot of elements about this film that definitely make it to be a strong X-Men film, especially with some of the stinkers we've had in this series coming up after this, especially the next one, X-Men Origins Wolverine, which is we're going to talk about that in probably sometime within the next week or so. But yeah, overall, I really do enjoy this film. I do think it's a movie that is a little messy. It's inconsistent with the story at times and inconsistent with its connection to the other films. And there are characters that do get sidelined from the other films, while we focus on some new characters here that don't necessarily need to be focused on. But the movie's filled with laughs. It's filled with great action. It's a good popcorn film. It's not the greatest X-Men film, but genuinely it's a film that I think gets way more crap than it deserves. And I always have a good time going back and revisiting it. So that's going to be my thoughts on X-Men The Last Stand. Again, a big thanks to Mike for joining me here in this video. Always a pleasure to have you on a video, my friend. Always a pleasure to have you in a video. Yeah, always a pleasure to have Mike in a video. Please, guys, the link to his channel is down below in the description box. Did you see that? Almost at 1,000 subscribers. Depending on when you see this video, he may have already hit 1,000 subscribers. But if you're not subscribed to Did You See That, what are you doing? If you're a Back to the Future fan, go give that man some love, because his channel is a complete just love letter to Back to the Future and yeah, he's just a great guy. I highly recommend going and checking out his channel, giving him some love, let him know I sent you. And for now, I will see you guys in the next video. So a big thanks to you guys again for watching. What are your thoughts on X-Men The Last Stand? Do you think it gets more hate than it deserves? Do you think it actually deserves the hate? Maybe name some of your favorite characters. Anything about this film you want to talk about. I want to see what you guys have to say down below in the comment section. Please do hit that like button. As I mentioned, it does really help the channel out. And subscribe for more videos. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.